Hey everybody, welcome back. It is 2:05. We are in the Flip Flopperator Auditorium. Just before we start, I have an announcement to make, which is we are looking for mentors for the sprints tomorrow. So I'm going to read the copy here. Would you like to get fresh eyes on your project? Do you get warm fuzzies from helping people out? There are still plenty of mentor slots available for Sunday's mentored sprints. Check the site for more details and how to register. Cool. Okay, moving on. Our next speaker requires no introduction.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Tom. I'm Kathy Reid, and as Tom didn't mention, I'm currently a PhD candidate at the 3E Institute at Australian National University, and I'm also a part-time member of Mozilla's Open Innovation team. I have a background in open source systems, and in recent years, I've specialised in voice and voice assistants. There are three things I'd like to do today before starting the talk proper. First, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm broadcasting today from the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people in Canberra, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and to leaders emerging. Secondly, I'd like to acknowledge that PyCon AU is a community-produced event, and I'd like to thank the organisers and volunteers for their time and their labour. Third, and most importantly, I'd like to acknowledge my positionality as a white woman giving a talk with the title Black Voices Matter and the criticism this might invite. My intent here is to support that movement by highlighting how we as a predominantly white community can think critically about the technical systems we build, the choices which they embody, and the unintended but foreseeable consequences that they can lead to. And to do that, we're going to cover three key areas today. We're going to take a look at voice assistants and ways in which they exclude minority groups, including African American and Indigenous people. We're going to relate this back to broader inequities in race by drawing causal connections from technical systems back to social systems, showing how they interrelate. And turning to how we might address issues, we're going to look at ways we, as conscientious technologists, can intervene and influence voice systems at a technical level. In doing so, we can contribute in a small way to the broader movements seeking to dismantle systemic and institutional racial inequity. First, let's take a look at voice assistants. Voice assistants are systems, assemblages of technologies like speech recognition and voice synthesis. They have the ostensible goal of helping people with various tasks, setting timers, playing music, finding information, and so on. Voice assistants take different forms: the digital assistant on your phone, a voice assistant in your home, an assistant in your car. Increasingly, voice is a component in complex cyber-physical systems. But as we shall see, voice assistants don't assist everyone. If you don't speak a major language, if you speak with an accent, if you can't afford the underlying infrastructure that voice assistants rely on. As William Gibson once famously said, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. Depending on how you count them, some estimates predict that by 2025, there will be 8 billion voice assistants in the world. Excuse me. Particularly in a time where we're concerned that touch interfaces, buttons, keypads, and other surfaces may be vectors for transmission of disease, it's not hard to imagine a voice-activated ATM or a voice-enabled vending machine or a voice-based assistant for your workplace. The point I'm making is that voice is going to scale. It's expanding through different trajectories, different hardware, different software, different use cases and contexts, different geographies and locales. And as it goes to scale, I'd like us to be reflecting on who that technology is being built for and why. And what might we want to change about that? How might we want to influence that evolution? So, what components are there in a voice assistant? What does a voice assistant need to work? Let's take a look at a voice assistant stack, because this will help to provide some context as we explore issues of racial equality and voice. The voice interaction starts with a wake word spotter, and the job of that layer is to constantly listen for wake words like OK Google, or Hey Mycroft. The speech recognition layer's job is to convert what's spoken next, an utterance, into text. This might be something like, set an alarm for 5 minutes, or what's the weather like today? This utterance is then passed and handed off to a skill, like an alarm skill or a weather skill. The text-to-speech layer's job is to synthesize voice and respond, like, the weather today is cloudy with a chance of snow. And around these layers, we have important components such as the voice user interface, the conversational structures that are used in interactions with voice assistants, and data that is used to train the machine learning models used by wake words and speech recognition. Data is a key component in voice assistants. Huge amounts of data are needed to train wake words and speech recognition models. So imagine 8 billion of these stacks in operation around the world. At the same time, there are over 7,000 languages spoken in the world. Just 23 of those languages account for over 50% of the world's population. And you can get a sense of these languages from this well-known data visualization from Alberto Lucas Lopez. But even though some of these languages are spoken by hundreds of millions of speakers, they're not all supported by voice assistants. In fact, when we look at which languages are supported by the big 4 companies in this space, the contrast is stark. For example, Google's STT engine supports 135 language variants. This is nearly 3 times more than their closest competitor, Amazon, which supports 44 variants. But if we dig a little deeper, we find that 55 of those 135 variants are of just 3 languages: English, Spanish, and Arabic. Even though there may be tens of millions of speakers of a language, it may not be supported by a voice assistant. I was pleasantly surprised that Google, and only Google, offers speech recognition in Kiswahili, a language from the Bantu family of languages spoken by over 100 million people in Kenya and Eastern Africa. No such luck, however, for the 44 million speakers of Hausa in Niger and Nigeria, or for the 38 million speakers of Yoruba in southwestern Nigeria. Compare this with Icelandic, spoken by just 340,000 people. Google supports speech recognition in Icelandic, and Amazon supports voice synthesis in Icelandic. If we turn our attention for just a moment to Australian Indigenous languages, it's unsurprising that there's no voice assistant support for languages such as Warlpiri, spoken by just 3,000 people in the Northern Territory, or the 3,000 speakers of Pitjantjatjara in the Western Deserts of Central Australia, or the 4,600 speakers of Yamata languages spoken in the Northern Territory. The inference here, the suggestion that I'm making, which would be a great topic for further research, is that there might be a relationship, not just between the number of speakers of a language, but by how lucrative the speakers of that language are as a market. Do languages have a monetary value? This assertion becomes a little stronger if we look at the Human Development Index. The Human Development Index is a composite of several different indicators. It takes into account educational, economic, and health outcomes. And here we can see an intersection, a through line, from voice assistance to more systemic inequities. Countries in this map that are shaded red and orange have the lowest human development score, the poorest educational, economic, and health outcomes. Languages like Nyarwanda and Hausa are spoken in countries that are shaded red and orange in this map. And this point is even clearer if we look at gross domestic product, an indicator of financial affluence versus language. This slide shows the percentage of world GDP by language by combining the GDPs of countries where a particular language is spoken. For example, the GDPs of countries that speak English have been combined to give the English percentage of 28.2 that we see there. And I should note that this chart is only current to 2010. It's 10 years old, but I can't find anything newer. A more current chart is likely to have English with a lower percentage and languages of emerging middle classes like Chinese, Hindi, Portuguese, and Spanish with higher percentages. but not a single African language, Kiswahili, Kinyarwanda, Hausa, Yoruba, Zulu, spoken by hundreds of millions of people in the world, makes this list? Is there far less support for languages spoken by the developing world because they are not affluent, because they have low GDP, because it doesn't make business sense to provide that support? Voice isn't being built for everyone. The future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed. But exclusion doesn't just happen at a country or a language level. Let's say that you're one of the 335 million or so people who speak English, one of the languages that is a lucrative language, a high GDP language. So if you speak English, you're going to be able to use voice technology that's built for English, right? Well, maybe. If you speak with an accent that your voice assistant has been trained on. If we recall the voice assistant stack for a moment, there are a couple of key components here. The wake word used to tell the voice assistant to expect a command, and the automatic speech recognition or speech-to-text layer, which transforms the audio in your spoken phrase, your utterance, into words. These components use machine learning to do this, and the data sets on which the machine learning models are trained has a significant bearing on how well a voice assistant recognizes a user. For example, recent research from Alison Koeneke and a team at Stanford showed that voice assistants on average have a word error rate, an indicator used for measuring accuracy in speech recognition, almost double for Black speakers compared to white speakers. This graph from that study shows that word error rate for several different voice assistants and plots the word error rate for Black and white speakers to show that gap. And there are a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, there's a linguistic and cultural heritage piece at play. Many African Americans speak a form of English known as African American Vernacular English. It's considered to be a particular dialect of English. And there are two key schools of thought about how this dialect developed. One, that it evolved as African Americans were used as slaves on plantations and other settings in the South of America. And another, that it evolved through the interactions slaves had with British settlers. What both these narratives have in common is a theme of cultural segregation, of being denied full participation in economy, education, and society for hundreds of years. Secondly, let's think about where the data that's used to train voice assistants comes from. On many voice assistants, unless you specifically opt out, the phrase, the utterances you speak to the assistant are used to further train it. And if we think about affordability and affluence, and that voice assistants need a constant internet connection to work well, this intersects with broader issues, such as the digital divide. For example, internet usage in America for African Americans is significantly less than for white people, as shown by this graphic from the Pew Research Center in America. Around 65% of Black people have home broadband, compared with over 80% for white people. If we apply this to the Australian context, a similar pattern emerges for the digital divide and Indigenous Australians, as shown here in the 2018 Digital Inclusion Index. The two graphs aren't exactly like for like. The Digital Inclusion Index is a composite metric that combines access to technology, digital ability, affordability, and so on. The point that I'm making is that historical and cultural issues of segregation and disadvantage, social mobility, educational opportunity, and economic participation continue to echo in the technologies that we build today. While we're talking about accents and the data that's used to train machine learning models, I'd also like to quickly cover low-resource languages. Languages that are considered low resource don't have a lot of recorded audio or written transcriptions, materials such as books or newspapers, which can be used to train machine learning models. In some cases, the lack of resources may be because the language is a spoken language. It may not have a written or orthographic tradition, such as many Indigenous Australian languages. In other cases, the language may have been suppressed through political power, such as Welsh or Cymru in Great Britain, or Te Reo Maori in New Zealand, or Alelo Hawaii in Hawaii. But even when language revitalisation efforts may be underway, attempts to provide language support, for example in voice assistants, face the additional problem of the transcription bottleneck. This is a workflow impediment that means the creation of resources consumes significant labour time, making it even harder and less financially viable to provide speech recognition or voice synthesis support in a particular language. For example, it can take several hours to transcribe 1 hour of recorded audio into text. Again, we see social and historical through lines impacting on how technology in general and voice assistants specifically evolve and go to scale. The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. One final point I'd like to make before we turn our attention to what we as a community might be able to do to help influence and shape voice technology as it goes to scale is around voice synthesis, also called text-to-speech. This is the part of the voice assistant stack that responds to a question or a command from the user. There have been rapid technical advances in this space in the past couple of years, driven by leaps in algorithms such as Tachytron and WaveNet. But if we take a look again at cloud providers who offer text-to-speech as an API, not a single one of them offers a voice that sounds African American or Indigenous Australian for that matter. This sits in contrast to the research that's been done in this space, which shows that people have a preference in general for voices that sound like them. For example, a series of experiments done by Clifford Nass and Scott Brave in the mid-2000s examined voice interfaces across many different axes: gender, personality, and importantly, race. They found that a product was viewed more positively when it was described by, and I'm quoting here, an agent whose accent allowed the participant to socially identify with it. This is unsurprising given how closely language is tied to the formation of our individual identities and to our sense of belonging to particular groups. Again, it seems that voice assistants aren't for everyone. So now that we've explored some of the ways in which various groups are excluded from using voice assistants due to the languages and accents they currently support, and how these technical issues are tied to much broader social and economic systems, what practical action can we take? What are the leverage points we have for shaping how voice assistants might evolve and go to scale? Well, there's a range of responses we can take, but I want to be clear, none of these individually will solve the broader systemic inequities outlined here, but they can play a small role in helping to materialise a world we want to live in. Firstly, I think we need to value languages for their intrinsic value rather than just their monetary value. We're starting to see some positive signs of this, with the resurgence in languages like Te Reo Māori and Welsh, and to some extent Australian Indigenous languages. And this trend has been buoyed by the United Nations designation of 2019 as the Year of Indigenous Languages, and by the designation of 2022 to 2032 as the Decade of Indigenous Languages. So we need to value languages for their cultural heritage value, their innate importance to cultural identity and belonging. Another area that represents a leverage point is metadata standards. If we recall that the wake word and speech recognition layers of the stack require a lot of data in order to produce machine learning models, this means that voice and speech data are the building blocks of machine learning models. One of the key problems we have here is that we don't have a defined metadata standard for those corpora, a way of describing the data they contain. Metadata describes a data set, and in voice this would mean having a way to explain the gender balance, the racial balance, the geographical origin, and other characteristics of speakers in a voice data set. For example, this is a graphical representation of the sound "whoa," but it doesn't describe the gender expression of the speaker, their accent, their cultural heritage, things that would help us create a more representative technology. Some early work has been done in this area by Mahol Garnerin's team at the Laboratoire d'Informatique in Grenoble in France, and his team have a suggested metadata schema, but there's a long way to go before this is validated and adopted in practice. Another tool that's gaining some prominence in this space is the Arty speech bias corpus. This was designed by Josh Meyer, a machine learning fellow at Mozilla, and his team. It's a corpus based on common voice that varies in gender and accent that you can compare other voice datasets to see if they exhibit bias. But even if we can describe the data we do have and what biases a corpus might have, we still need to address the lack of data for some languages. One of the hardest problems to solve for voice assistants is being able to gather enough data in order to train models for wake words and speech recognition. There are some incredible resources already available, such as the Common Voice dataset, but there are many languages where corpora don't exist and many accents that are not covered by existing corpora. So we need more data to enable technologies for low resource languages, and in many cases to help preserve those languages. And once we have recordings, we need to think about the transcription bottleneck problem for low resource languages. We need better tools here to make it quicker for researchers and linguists to be able to transcribe languages. There are some really interesting tools in this space coming out of the Centre of Excellence for Dynamic Languages, CODAL, which is based at the University of Queensland. There are two tools, both open source, that are helping here, Elpis and Persephone. They work by quickly transcribing audio recordings based on a minimal amount of language corpus to make the transcriber's job quicker and easier, so they'll train a minimal model. In conclusion, this talk has started with the premise that as voice assistants expand and go to scale, particular cohorts of people are excluded from using them on the basis of language and accent. As we've explored these themes, I've related them back to broader social and cultural frames to show that voice assistants are socio-technical systems. And to address these shortcomings and to help shape and influence voice technology as it expands, there are practical steps we as conscientious technologists concerned with the world we're building through the tools and systems we create can take, including the need for better metadata, better tools for transcription, and better volume of data, particularly for low resource languages. So the future is already here. How about we distribute it a little bit more evenly? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kathy. That was amazing. We have one question from Maya, which is, how can we tie monetary returns to the inherent value of language use to change this?
That's a great question. To answer that question, I'd like to talk a little bit about the role of government in language preservation. So I think the part of the key problem that we have at the moment is that it's not financially viable for commercial providers to provide support for low resource languages because the people who speak that language are not a targeted consumer market or because there's a very small number of speakers. I think, though, that there's a role for government to play here in trying to fill that gap that business cannot service. So if you think about government providing the services that the free market is unable or unwilling to provide, I think that governments have a huge role to play here in either financing or supporting the creation of resources for low resource languages and the ability that that provides to preserve that language and to provide services in that language. And I think a key example of that is the huge support that the New Zealand government has provided for the revitalisation and creation of resources in Te Reo Māori. And there are similar efforts as well in Great Britain for the revitalisation of Welsh. So I think there's a huge role here for the government to play.
I have a question from Daniel who asks, is Kathy optimistic about the direction the world is heading with regards to tackling these issues? And what tools or resources are recommended for making things more accessible?
I'm neither an optimist nor a pessimist. I consider myself a realist. And what that means is that unless we take specific action to change the world, it's going to continue along on the trajectory that it's going on at the moment, and that means that we're not going to have resources available in low resource languages. We're not going to have voice for everyone. There's a lot of things that we can do. So, for example, this is quite controversial at the moment because of Mozilla and sort of their move away from voice. But what I'd like to see is an expansion of the Common Voice program and an expansion of the tools that we have for collecting voice data, and an expansion of the tools we have for transforming that data through machine learning models into automatic speech recognition or into voice synthesis. And I think that's also time bound. So I think we have a very short window in which to put significant effort into this because of the rate of death of our active and living languages at the moment. So we're losing, estimates vary, dozens to hundreds of Indigenous languages every single year, because as the speakers of those languages get older, the next generation are not speaking those languages as first languages, and then over time the language is just not taught or spoken or learned anymore. So I think we have a very small window of opportunity. But I'm a realist. Without people recognising that this is a problem and committing to change, we're not going to change anything.
Thank you very much, Kathy. We are out of time now, but there is one more question in the chat. So I'd like to invite you to check out the chat once we're off stream, so that can be answered either in the chat with the stream or out in the hallway track, if Nikki would repeat her question out there. Thank you so much. That was spectacular. We will be back
Absolute pleasure.
at 2:40. Sorry, Kathy? Cool. Take care. Thank you so much. We'll see you in 8 minutes.